Gotta give us permission to rejoice. Young and free, no one over 40. Apparently we'll exchange wealth for toil. Go up by sea. It's just describing the location on a map. Wait a minute. This song is terrible. You could hire someone on Fiverr and get better lyrics than this. But nonetheless, we are going to be making this. Not the Australian flag, obviously, but your own in Blender. So I'm going to show you how to start with a plane, make it look like fabric, add wind, all those little settings, what all those settings mean and what they do to the end flag. And yeah, essentially just having some simple fun. If you're a beginner to Blender, this is a good one to start on. It's very simple. It's a good one to get you into simulations. But yeah, at the end of it, you should have a nice little video that you can use to make your own patriotic video, or you could just flog it off on Pond 5 like a bunch of people did the last time I did this tutorial. But anyways, without further ado, let's go ahead and open up Blender. Alright, so we're going to start by deleting everything, just so that it makes it easier to focus on our flag. Select it all and delete. Now, we need to have an object in order to do anything. So if you hit Shift A to bring up this list here, you know, obviously the plane is the most similar to a flag, but actually I'm going to use this one, which is images as planes. Now, if you don't see that, just go to File, User Preferences, Add-ons, and then type in planes, and you should see it there, import images as planes. Now, the reason we're going to use this, when you click it, by the way, it'll ask for the image. So all you're going to do is just select the flag of the country that it is you're making. Now, the reason that we're using this add-on is that this, when you click import, is it will create a plane which is at the exact dimensions of your flag. Because if you've got a squarish flag or a really long flag or whatever, it's important that it actually matches the correct, you know, UV coordinates of your object, right? Yeah, anyway, all right, so this is it here. Now I'm going to rotate it along the x-axis. So if I hit R and then X, and then if I just hold down Control while I'm moving that, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, once it gets to 90, I'm just going to click, and there it is. And I hate this little widget because it always gets in the way, so I'm turning that off. All right, now the cloth simulator will actually need to use the physical geometry of your plane here. Now, if you go into edit mode, you can see we've only got 4 points here, so that wouldn't be much of a cloth sim. So what we need to do is give it more geometry. So normally the way you do this, and don't do this, just as an example, is we would hit W and then subdivide, and then we would increase our cuts down there. But you can see that when I did this, these faces here are rectangles, which isn't actually desirable for simulations because, and for a number of like displacements, other things like that, because then you get basically more geometry vertically than you would horizontally. So it's not an accurate cloth sim. So before I do that step, what I want to do is I want to add a loop cut by hitting Control R and then clicking so that it places one vertically. And all I want is I just want to make it so that I've got 2 squares, essentially. So once I got that, I'm just going to click right-click, so it's just going to be in the exact center there. And you can see I've now got 2 squares. So now if I do that step, W subdivide, you can see that I've got squares here, which is great. So I'm going to turn this all the way up to 10, and then I'm just going to hit subdivide one more time, which will give us, I believe, 20 faces along each axes, right? 20. Yeah, it should be 20. No, maybe 40 along this because it was, yeah, cut in the middle. Anyways, you get the idea. So now we've got some geometry. Now we can add the cloth simulator. So with our object here selected, go over to the physics panel and click on cloth. Now, if you were to hit Alt-A for the animation, you would see that it just disappears right off the edge of the screen. Now, what it's actually doing, to prove it, I'll just show you this very quickly. It is actually using the cloth sim, okay? But it's, you know, it's gravity, and it's like you've just dropped, you know, a piece of fabric, right? So it doesn't really have anything else to go off. So what we need to do, first of all, is we want to make it pinned, okay? So that it, on this left-hand corner there, because that's where the flagpole is going to be, we want it to be attached to that point. So everything else moves, but that part is stuck there. So we want to use this feature here in the cloth simulator called pinning. By the way, if all these numbers here and everything looks a little bit confusing and daunting, don't worry, we will get to that. Just doing it one piece at a time. So you click pinning, and what it's going to ask you for right here is which vertex group do we use for the pinning. So the vertex group is found up here in the object data. And here is, here's the vertex group. So click the plus button there, and we've now created a group. You could even double click it and give it a name if you wanted to. When you hit tab to go into edit mode, you'll see that you get these options that appear underneath it. So what you're going to do is you're going to select the vertice or the group of vertices that you want to remain stationary. So in our case, it's this left-hand one over on the left-hand corner there. So I'm just holding down Alt, and then I clicked on that edge right there, and then I've hit assign right here. So what it's doing is it's assigning a weight value of 1 to just those vertices. And if you want to see the effect of that to make sure that it's correct, if you go into weight paint mode, you should see this. Totally blue except for one edge being red. If you don't see that, by the way, you can just select everything, set the weight to 0 for everything, and then select this, just your edge again, and hit assign with a weight of 1. Anyway, that's it. Okay, so now that we've done that, go back to the cloth settings, and underneath pinning, we're going to enable pin, which was the name of our group that we added there. Now when we animate it, you can see it's looking a little bit like a flag, okay? But there is a problem, of course, and that's that the flag, you'll notice, it's just going through itself, which is a completely odd, very unrealistic scenario. It just should never happen in the real world. Now, the reason it's doing that is that we haven't got self-collision on. So that one's really easy. Just turn on self-collision. And look at that. Now it collides with itself, goes through itself in a few places. Well, that's how cloth sims work. There's a degree of errors that it allows, and in this case, it's letting that through. But we'll fix stuff later on. Okay, so we have now got a flag which is, you know, falling down onto itself. We obviously want to make it stay upright a little bit. So for that, we're going to use Shift A, and we're going to add in Forcefield Wind right there. Okay, so you can see that it's added in this circular looking object with an arrow. Obviously, the arrow is the direction that the wind is going to be facing. So we want to rotate it by 90 degrees from the front view. So I'm in front view, and I'm going to hit R to rotate, and then just hold down Control as you rotate, and you'll see the bottom left-hand corner, it'll say 90. That's it. So I'm now going to move that to the left-hand corner. Sorry, just to the, somewhere close. Actually, it doesn't matter where it is in your object, in your scene, because it will just treat it along that entire axis. But yeah, anyway, right there is fine. So now, if you were to animate this, you would see that, again, nothing is happening, or it seems as though nothing is happening. It is actually having a wind effect on this object here. The problem is that the wind is really, really weak. This value here, like by default, it's 1. I think it should be 1,000 by default, because when you set it up to 1,000, you'll see that you actually get some effect there, okay? Now we can see it's a little bit is blowing through. Let's turn it up to 2,000. Let's see how that goes. There we go. Awesome. So look at that. We've got the very first step of a flag animation. Essentially, it doesn't look too great right now. It looks a little heavy. It's got a bunch of other stuff going on, which is fine. Now, one thing I want to do before we go any further, because we're going to get into the cloth settings, and I noticed myself that if you're just looking at the cloth sim on this blank plane here, it's sort of it's hard to imagine how it would look on a flag. Like it's like you start adjusting all these settings here for this plane, but then when I actually did the animation at the end, I rendered it out, it looked weird, and I realized it because it was the first time I actually saw the object with the texture on it, and then it felt weird. So all that to say is I want you to change to texture view mode, and when you do that, you should see your flag texture on it. And now you can see it feels differently. Like now you can sort of relate to that object because it's a flag. It's very clearly a flag, and you know how a flag should move. So just one of those little things that'll help you. You may notice, by the way, that there is also like little blocks on it. So just enable smooth shading, and now it's smooth. Look at that. The other, and one more thing as well. I find that the grid floor and the wind, all that stuff gets in the way, and it doesn't help you to understand the cloth. So again, just to simplify it, I'm enabling only render right there, which means you won't be able to see anything else, but that's fine because all we're going to do is focus on the cloth. All right, so cloth settings. There is a lot of settings here, and I want to go through them all, but I just want you to focus on just these first three: the mass, the structure, and the bending. So first thing is the mass. Now, if you change the mass, essentially all you're doing, if you make it less, you're making it appear lighter. If you turn it up, then it's going to appear more weighty, which is pretty easy to understand. I've done some little cloth sim setting tests here, so you can actually see the results. So you can see different effects have different looks, essentially. If you go all the way up too high, it sort of starts to look like a wet jumper blowing in the breeze. You can, by the way, these settings here, the simulators are very weird in the way they work. Like, it depends on how many vertices you've got on your mesh. So these ones that I've got right here, I think I was using a higher resolution plane, which means that these exact values here that, like, you might say, oh, I like 0.2 or 0.1. Don't think of it like that. These examples, because I've got a bunch of them I'm going to show here, they are just to be used as reference to understand how this setting works. Okay, so that's the mass, essentially. So I'm going to set it to 0.1 and just see how it looks. So you just want to have a look at it and sort of gauge whether or not you want it to be lighter or heavier. And to me, that looks pretty good. So I'm going to leave that there. The next one is the structure. So the structure is, as a little tooltip will tell you, the overall stiffness of the structure, which isn't very helpful to imagine. But I've done these little tests here, and you can see that as you turn the structural value up, it almost becomes looks almost like it's semi-frozen, or like it's moving through water or something like that. So I personally find that really low values work quite well. Not too low. You can see that when it gets to 0.1, it actually begins to look almost like melted cheese. Like it starts to elongate, like a piece of elastic, right? So, or a piece of cheese. So you don't want that. So you want it to have its, basic structural value. So I'll try 0.5 and I'll see how that looks. If it looks like it's stretching, you can see as I turn this down, and if you go all the way down, it's like, you don't want that. So you don't want to go 0.1, somewhere where it's not, okay, that's still stretching too much. Let's go up to 0.5, maybe 0.6. That looks pretty good to me. Again, these are just values. I want you to play with them, have some fun with it. It doesn't have to be exact. The next one we're going to have a look at is bending, okay? So bending is, I guess you could imagine it as similar to structure, but it's actually different. It's the size of the wrinkles of the fabric. So if you were animating a piece of stiff denim, for example, you would use higher values, values like down here. But we're just imagining this as a piece of fabric, like a piece of fabric. Like cotton, like nylon, like silk, right? So you just want to have really small values. If you go too small, you can start to get basically it can sort of collapse on itself, and the simulator isn't so good when it's colliding with itself constantly. It can sort of get stuck. So just note, if you go too low, it can look a little odd. But anyways, let's just play with it while it's animating. So I'll just turn this down. Let's just see how it looks. So you can see as I turn it down, I get smaller wrinkles appearing across it. Okay, 0.05. Let's see if that breaks it. Okay, so those are really small wrinkles when I go to 0.05. But I don't know, it's not actually breaking. I haven't got too many errors in the simulator, so it looks pretty fine to me. I actually quite like that. I think actually that structure, that's kind of annoying me a bit. I think it should be... it looks a little bit too cheesy for me, melted cheese, so I just turned it up a little bit. Okay, that's pretty good. Now, the next one to mention is that you might be looking at this and you think like, I really need, I want there to be more wavy, clothy effects because there isn't enough detail in here. So you might be tempted to add in a subdivision surface modifier, right? Now that will do two things. One, it will give you more geometry to work with, okay? But the other thing is that it will drastically increase your simulator. And the other thing is that the simulator settings that you used before will now look different. You can see this now looks a lot heavier. And that's because, for whatever reason, I personally don't understand it myself, but it's like it treats, so the vertices that I've got here, I've got 1035 vertices, right? If we have more vertices, it treats it, yeah, like it's heavier. The less vertices you have, the lighter it looks. So as an example, here's some tests I did. Okay, you can see that with really, like, the lower you go, it starts treating it like it's a piece of paper almost, right? But then the higher you go, it just, like, look how weighty it is at Subdivision 4. And by the way, once you get to that level, that's really, really, really long bake times, okay? So yeah, it's not ideal to increase it. You should only increase it when you need to. And this is the not annoying thing, is like what the way you work as an artist, like you don't render at, you know, when you're doing a final render, you keep your samples down in the preview mode, right? But then when you do the final render, you crank it up because it's the final render. So with a cloth sim, you want to do the same. You want to keep it low whilst you're working with it so you can actually see how it moves. But then for the final, you know, the final one, you want to add a subdivision. But then when you do that, all the settings that you previously set over here no longer work. So it's really annoying, actually. And I don't know if other software treats it differently. I imagine this simulator is probably based on an algorithm that's been in use by the industry for so long. I have no idea. But either way, you just have to be aware of it, that if you increase this value for your final sim or whatever, you're going to have problems. So I'm actually going to reduce that because there's something else you can do to add more detail. So I've reduced it so that now it is actually just playing at like normal speed, which is nice, or close to normal speed. It's enough to actually see the movement. One thing that you can do instead of adding a subdivision is increasing the steps here, because I'll show you. Watch this. So I've done some steps testing, and this really surprised me to see this. So steps, oh, hang on, let me just delete, otherwise it's going to play through a playlist or whatever. So steps, you can see that as you increase the steps, you get more and more detail across the cloth simulator. It does increase your bake times, but nowhere near as much as the adding another subdivision. And you can see that, like, this is with a pretty high poly plane as well, that I was getting, like, you know, 1 or 2 waves when the steps were set to 1. 2 or 3, you know, you can see the number of waves across it at any one point. And then as you increase it, you get really, really, like, a lot of this wavy effect. So, you know, again, use it to, you know, to whatever you want. Like if I set this really low to 1, you can see that it renders, like, the baking time is really fluid, really, really fast, but you're getting like some pretty big waves across it. So if we increase the steps to 3, you can see that it looks like it's got a little bit more life to it. It's a little bit easier to read. And if you increase it to 4 or 5, let's try that, then you'll get even more detail. Like so. So now it actually starts to look like proper fabric, right? Let's increase it to 7. You can see that it does start to slow down your animation when you do that, but you can see it starts to look a little bit like there's more movement in it. You're getting more waves across it. So that's the steps. Yeah. Now, on the right-hand side over here, you've got 3 more settings. You've got spring, air, and velocity. So looking at those, the first one, spring. Where's my thing? Spring. There it is. So what is spring doing? Yeah, this one was surprising to me because I didn't think it would actually have much of an effect. When you mouse over it, oh yeah, it's like it's jiggleness. That's right, like how jiggly it is. But looking at this, you really can't see that much difference between 0.1 and 0.5, except in like maybe the ends, like the tiny little corners. They sort of flop around a little bit more than they do in these higher settings. You can see it a bit more, yeah, in the 0.1 and 5, you can see that there's a big difference, like in just the corners. So it is a very subtle thing. But again, you can imagine that these values down here would be better suited to something which was heavy fabric, denim, or I don't know, some thick cloth, you know, like a heavy jumper or something, right? And also, I guess if you were having errors with your cloth sim where it was like jiggling like crazy, you could increase it then as well. But anyway, I'm going to decrease it to 0.1, which is a really low setting, but it's going to give it more of a jiggleness. And you can see it especially in the corners. Now it's really just flapping around like crazy, which is cool. Okay, the next one underneath it is air. So this is the dampening effect that objects have when it goes through the air. Okay, so if I turn this up to 20, you'll see that it moves almost like it's in slow motion, or low gravity or something like that. The best way to really think about it is it's like it's moving underwater, because you can imagine if you move your hand underwater, it's really slow, but if you move it through the air, it's really quick. And that's just because the air has more dampening. I know it's probably not called dampening. You don't have to email me, but that's the best way to think of it. So as this fabric is flopping around, if you go too low, it almost doesn't even look real, because it's really just flopping around, and it can go like left, right, and it doesn't slow down at all as it's just flopping around there. And that's not how objects move in the real world, because if you've got a parachute or whatever and sort of like pull it down, it's going to slow down in relation to the air around it. So I find that a value of 1 was too high. Let me just bring this up. Yeah, the default value is 1. Yeah, so if you set it really low, if you get it like this flopping effect like that, I had that sometimes in my simulation. It was really annoying. If you just increase the air amount, it'll stop it from doing that crazy left to right stuff. So I think of the air as the left to right of the flag, or what is it, the depth, like how much it sort of goes in between those values there. So yeah, if I want it to look really floppy like crazy, I just turn it down, but this looks pretty good to me. Yeah, it's a little crazy. If it, you know, I might increase it later if I want to, but yeah, it's fine to me. The next one is the velocity. Yeah, this was the one that was surprising, because it seems as though it's talking about the resting position. Like, say you had fabric that was thrown onto a plane, it would bounce off the plane and then it would stop. So I imagined that because our object is constantly moving, that it wouldn't have an effect. And yet, when I did a little test run, you can see here that, yeah, the one that has the velocity of 1, as opposed to 0, definitely moves and flows a lot easier than the one with 0. So yeah, it does have some effect. So anyway, the default value is 1. I don't think you can actually go higher than that. No, it's just 1 or anywhere in between that. But yeah, I'm going to keep it at 1, which is nice. This is really jumping around like crazy, isn't it? Yeah, I might increase the air, maybe a little bit of the spring as well. Just sort of dial it back a bit, buddy. You're going a little bit all over the place. Okay, cool. Great. So we've talked about most of these. There's another one at the top there, Multiplier. That is really just the speed of the cloth. Now, if you've got all your settings correct, you shouldn't need to use this, because it's basically exaggerating the speed. It's like double time, right? Let's see, spring, speed. Where's the speed? I don't have the speed. Oh, multiplier. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so this is if you increase the multiplier. As you can see, it's like it's on fast motion. It doesn't really make any sense, because it does look like it's flapping in the wind, but you can see that the top part looks really stiff because it's just staying like that. It's like, yeah, it's not the correct way to do it. You should be using other settings. So we'll just leave it at 1 for pretty much everything. Okay, dynamic mesh, I don't believe that has much of an effect. It's really, I didn't do a test on it, but basically, I think it's, if you've got stuff above it, I don't know, other modifiers, I believe if you check that, you might get better results, maybe. I didn't really find much difference, but anyway, there was that. Okay, cool. These other ones down here, if you find that the part of your cloth is like sticking, it's getting stuck into it, you can turn up the distance from when it will recognize a self-collision so that it sort of stops it before it goes through each other. You can also turn up the quality if that's still not working. By the way, increasing the steps there at the top will also change. It's almost like it's adding geometry like in this mode, it's adding a little bit of geometry in there so it can recognize collisions better as well. So if you use a really low step value, then you might get collisions happening a lot more than if you had a higher step value up there, even though there's the quality setting there as well. It's a little bit confusing. Anyway, so that is looking pretty good to me. Let me just check. The next one to talk about is, go back to, so we can see everything here. I want to talk about the wind effect. Okay, so with different amounts of wind, you can get different results. You go really high, it just, yeah, it starts to elongate and stretch the fabric or whatever. But you could see that, yeah, it's like different winds, right? Tornado versus a gentle breeze. Ours is actually 1,000 now. And you might think like, well, ours is a lot more jumpier than this one. And that's because, again, I was using a higher poly thing for these little tests here, which also increased the bake time, which was annoying for every single test that I did here. Had to rebake. But anyways, so this is just for your reference. Higher values, it starts to look a little bit different. So what we can do here is we can say, actually looking at this, you know, 2,000. Oh, we had 2,000, not 1,000. 2,000 is a little heavy. It's looking a little bit like it's in a gale force wind or something like that. I'm going to turn it down to 1,000. Okay, to try and get a more gentle sort of breeze. Okay, now the problem you find is that the flag is too lowered down, like it's too far down. So there are a couple of things that you can do with this. Is you could decrease the mass of your object so that, yeah, essentially it's a lighter looking object, and you can see that it's now raised up higher. And the other thing you can do is underneath field weights, you could change the gravity. The amount of, if I go to half gravity, you could see that it's, yeah, it's sort of got the same motion almost, but it's now staying at a sort of, yeah, it's more level to how it should be, I guess, if there was a different. You want to be able to see what the flag, the country of the flag is, right? So you want to have it like that. But yeah, to this point, I want to say that you'll notice that some of the values reflect other values. So you can see I've got wind 5,000 here, and then I got wind 10,000 there, and you can see the difference with that wind there. But if I had the wind kept at 5,000, but I decreased the mass and decreased the gravity, which is what I've just done there, you can see that it is at basically the exact same, like the vertical height of the top of the flag is pretty much the same as if it had wind of 10,000. So you can see how, and it's, again, it's interesting to know, but it's also annoying because you adjust one value here, like, all right, I want to make it look heavier, right? And then suddenly it's heavier, so it's not as far up here. So then you know adjust this setting, and then that reflects this setting. So that's sort of the game of simulation work, is you're constantly pushing and pulling values back, and they all reflect on each other. And it's why, honestly, simulations generally, in my experience, they take about, like if I'm making a tutorial, I know that a static image tutorial, like with a static frame, like use that as the value of 1. If I'm making an animation, it's times 4, like it takes 4 times as long to make that animation tutorial, like this one, for example. And if it's a simulation tutorial, it takes about 10 times as long to get all those settings right. In fact, actually doing all of these little tests here, this was the only way I could actually understand all these settings, because otherwise you're pushing and pulling things, you don't know what's going on. It's very, very frustrating. So just know that some will affect others. That's just how it is. So anyways, to say that, I want to keep the gravity at a sort of respectable amount, so that it, you know, it does feel like it does have some weight to it, so the top of it will flop down. But to do that, then it will, you know, if I set it all the way up, then it will go too far down. So I'm decreasing the mass so that it will, you know, it still will, like, it'll reduce, yeah, essentially the weight of it, which is also the gravity. But yeah, that honestly, that looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to go to only render just so I can see how this looks from this view, because it's much easier to see it as a flag when you've got everything else out the way. You can sort of imagine how it looks on a pole or whatever. I think that structure, it's looking a little bit like melted cheese again. So I'm just turning that up. Okay, that's pretty good. And the structure, you'll remember, is sort of like the left and right movement as well, which is sort of similar to the air. So because I increase the structure, I'm just going to decrease the air to give it more of a floppy left and right motion, which is cool. Let's try that. There we go. All right, pretty good. Oh, by the way, if you want all these settings, like these little tests here, I'm going to put them up on Blender Guru. So if you just click the link in the YouTube description, yeah, then you can actually have a look at each one in focus if you want. All right, that looks pretty good to me. So now that I'm happy with it, now we can get into the materials and the lighting. So trying to make it look like a nice thing, because you know this looks cool, but it's the viewport. We want to actually render it out with the sky and proper lighting and everything. So yeah, the first thing I'm going to do, oh, hang on a minute, I hit Shift Z, I went into rendered mode. I want to go to solid mode, and I'll stop this. And the first thing we need to add is the lighting, because obviously it's no good to just start adding materials, because then you can't actually see how it looks on it without light. So you're welcome to, like, there's a very easy way to do this. If you just want outdoor lighting, you can do it like this by adding a sun lamp, you know, tweaking that, whatever. I'm going for realism, so I'm actually going to use Pro Lighting Skies, which is, a link for that is in the YouTube description if you want it. You don't have to use it. I'm not forcing you to use it. People always get really uppity, but I'm really just saving time, essentially, because it's what Pro Lighting Skies is doing is it's adding an HDR automatically into the background, and you can select, you know, different sunsets or whatever. And it's easy in this case, especially because it's both affecting the lighting and it's giving us a background for our flag. So yeah, the one I'm going to use, I like this one, Cloudy 6, right there. And that, if I just rotate that a little bit further, I want to try and get like a nice shadow across it. Okay, so where's that? All right, it's a little bit more. Come on. There we go. That's maybe a little bit too far. But I want to try and, yeah. Okay, so I've got some shadow appearing there, so that looks pretty good to me. The other thing that I'm going to enable is the Filmic log encoding base. So if you haven't watched my Filmic Blender tutorial, there's a link for that in the YouTube description as well. I got to remember to put these in. But basically, yeah, we just enable that and then set that to base contrast, and it's going to allow the light to behave a lot more like light. And in doing so, we can now increase these values here. So I can set this to like 5, or maybe even 5 is too much. Let's go down to 3. And the sky as well. Sort of brighten it. Actually, that looks really way too much, doesn't it? Yeah, let's set that to 1. Okay, and then that one to 1. Okay. But there we go. All right, so that is essentially our lighting. I think it looks okay. We'll get more shadows and things across it in a second. So, yeah, one thing that's really lacking in our render right now is, let me just, 1 second. I'm not too happy with the shadows. I might just rotate it. Let's see if we can get a better shadow across it. Okay, that's, yeah, 240. There we go. Okay, that looks a little bit nicer to me. So, yeah, just trying to get some nice shadows across it. Okay, oh, one thing as well. So if you notice with your flag, if you select your flag, if you add a subdivision surface across it, because you'll notice here you've got these little triangles, and that's really, it's not good. So we're adding a subdivision after our cloth sim. So we don't have to rebake our cloth sim, we're just smoothing the effect that the cloth sim has already given us. And if you've still got the triangles and you don't like them, you can increase it up 1 more, and you should basically have got rid of them at that point. So that looks pretty good. All right, so now our lighting is set up. It looks good. Now we're going to split our view to get into the node editor, because we are going to be fixing up our material. So by default, it that add-on, the images as planes add-on, it automatically added in an image, our little flag image, into a diffuse shader, and that's it, which is pretty good. That's a nice start. But real fabric, when you see a real flag move in the breeze, it's got a number of other things going on. For one, you will have detail in your flag, like fine wrinkles that your eye is used to seeing, But on here we don't have, because unless we were to turn up the subdivisions, you know, a crazy amount, bake it forever. I mean, you still wouldn't get that detail, but you're going to be lacking it. So we're going to add in that. The other thing it's lacking is a fine grain of the of fabric, because if you get your shirt or whatever, put your eye up close to it, you'll see there's these tiny little microscopic detail in the fabric there. So we need some textures in order to do that. So there are a number of places that you could get textures. I've actually tested out a number of different sites. But yeah, so the first one is textures.com, which I don't recommend because theirs are actually just photos. They don't have the normal maps, the spec maps, any of that stuff. It's just color images, which are not nice, and you're going to be missing a lot of detail there. So I wouldn't recommend that. The next one is Substance Source. So they've recently opened up a library, which you can subscribe to, I guess. I don't know the cost. I think it's quite expensive. But theirs are photo scanned, which look okay. But I had a look. I tested them. I went up really close to it. And because fabric is so microscopic, it's so tiny, you can really only see it when you look at it with a microscope. It's missing some of the data. So it's sort of like it blurs some of the fabric threads together. So it's not as nice. So I wouldn't recommend them either. Texturing XYZ is better because it's digitally created, but they had some tiling issues, and I believe theirs are about $5 or so per texture, so it's a little bit expensive. The last one, and the one that of course I recommend because it's my own site, is Polygon. So Polygon is obviously texture material website. And yes, I'm doing a little plug. I know people are like, oh, now you're just making tutorials to plug your own site. Oh yeah, we spent all this time making the textures. I want to show them off, right? I'm hoping that it's actually useful to you guys. But anyways, you can get your textures from anywhere. I don't actually care. But anyways, these are digitally created. So the detail is really in, like, it was created by a computer. So right down to the microscope, it looks like real fabric does. And it's got, the diffuse, the displacement, the gloss. Yeah, basically I'm finicky about this stuff. And so it's really important that it's, looks like fabric. So we tested a number of different things. And these are the maps and the settings that it should use. We've also got Object ID, which I'll show you in a second as well. The one that I'm going to use for this, that's sort of a general sort of fabric look, is this one, which is called Canvas. And you can see that it's, basically like a basic fabric look, and you can make it look like any type of fabric just by scaling it, essentially. The biggest difference between fabric, by the way, is the pattern. So this twill pattern is like diagonal. This broadcloth is like, yeah, it's like if you Google it, like broadcloth, twill, you can actually see the weave patterns and how it works. The actual fabric itself, like whether it's cotton or muslin or any polyester, all that stuff, really doesn't matter in terms of rendering because it's all just fabric. It's just the actual pattern. So Canvas is a sort of a general one. So that's the one that we're going to use. So to start, I'm going to go add in an image texture here. Click open. I'm going to select, okay, so these are the textures here that you'll get. The first one is color, which you don't really actually need because color, you don't want shadows or any of that baked into it. And in our case, we've already got the flag color there. So we don't actually need to use the color, but I do want to use the bump, okay? Now there are two bump maps that you can use, a displacement map or a normal map. So normally I would recommend a normal map, but we're actually going to use a normal map later for something else. So instead, we're just going to use a displacement map. So I'm going to click open. All right, and then in order to make this affect the object, we need to basically drag this into the normal input. Now, it won't be able to read it because it's going from color to normal. So what you need to do is feed it through a bump map. So drop that in there and then make sure that this is in the height input. So it's going from the color to the height of our bump map. It's there going into the normal. And now you can see that it's actually affecting our flag. Now that is way too big. Oh, and the other thing as well is you want to make sure that you're not using color data, but non-color data. And it will look a lot more accurate when you do that. Even though you might not have been able to tell much there, it will look a lot punchier and crisper when you use non-color data, which you should, I try to remind people, it always should be non-color data unless it's directly influencing the color of the object. So that's really the only one that needs color. Okay, so we want to reduce the scale of our what do you call it, thing? Completely blanked. Cotton, whatever we want to call it, fabric, right? But the other problem, and I don't know if you can actually see it here, but the fabric looks stretched. That fabric pattern, it's sort of stretched. It looks like, yeah, you've got more detail vertically than you do horizontally. And the reason for that is that you might remember, or actually, no, we didn't even do the UV unwrapping. It's automatically UV unwrapped it using that images as planes thing. But that was suitable for this, like our rectangular flag here. But this is a square map. So it's having to stretch it across this object here. So essentially what we want to do is add a new UV map down here. I'm just going to click that, and I'm going to type in square, just so that I know which one it is. And then let me go into the front view right here. Select all of those, hit U, and then select project from view. Okay, what happened? Why is it, hang on, why is that not actually working? Say unwrap, project from view. What? Hang on a minute. Sometimes I swear it gets stuck. Clear the scale. Yeah, see, this is a bug. I swear it is a bug. This shouldn't be happening. It's supposed to do it based on the view, which means it's supposed to do that. Okay, reset. I still did it wrong. All right, well, that's really, really frustrating. Yeah, sometimes the UV unwrapper, it gets stuck in whatever mode that it was in before. Let's try another one. Project from view. No, so it's still messed up. All right, well, in this case, I happen to know that this is like its dimensions. Oh, where are its dimensions? Okay, so it's twice long as it is tall. So I know that in this case, with my UV map here, I can scale this along the y-axis by 0.5, and now it will actually be accurate. But that should have worked. Every other time I've rehearsed the tutorial, that's worked automatically, but it hasn't in this case. But anyway, all I want is this look here. Okay? Now that I've done that, I'm going to go back to this view here. And I want to make sure that this fabric bump, because it is a square image, is using this UV map, which by default it's not, because that little camera there means it's using this one by default. So I'm going to add in input, UV map, and then here from the list, select square, and then drop that in there. And when you do that, you can see that this, I mean, it looks a lot bigger, but it no longer has that rectangular look. You can see the clear difference between them. Cool. Awesome. So we want to make the scale of it. We actually want to make those bumps look a lot smaller in size. So I'm going to add in a mapping node, drop that in there, and I'll set the scale values here will become how many times it's scaled. So if I set it to 555, you can see exactly, what was that? Okay, yep. You can see that it's now a lot smaller. I actually want to go really small because I don't want it to look like, you don't want to be able to see too much detail of those bumps there. And I also want to decrease the strength of that bump there in my bump node. Okay, so something around 0.2, 0.1 I think should look pretty good. Cool. Awesome. Now the other thing you might have noticed, by the way, is you've got rounded edges to your flag. So yeah, we don't want that. So we can fix it very quickly. If you I actually just noticed this, but if you double click, like if you're holding down Alt and then you click, it'll do the edge select. But if you like double click it, it'll select the entire ring, which is kind of a cool cool trick. I didn't know how long it's been doing that. But anyways, once I've selected all that, if I hit Shift E and then drag outwards, you can see that I've got a crease along this edge there. And now you can see that it's sharpened up those edges. Yay for us. Hey. All right, so let me just quickly do a quick animation so that it can actually look like fabric. Because whenever you, I think whenever you enter edit mode and change something, it has to rebake the data. You can see, by the way, the data that it's baked in the timeline there. The blue part means it's baked. All this stuff over here hasn't been baked yet. When you want to do your final animation, by the way, before I forget, you want to go underneath cloth cache and click bake there, and that will hard bake it. Okay. Awesome. All right, so let me just have a look, just get a nice frame. Okay, with some shadows there. Awesome. All right, so it's starting to look a little bit like a flag. Now, we mentioned before that there should be some wrinkles in there, right? That's one thing you notice when you look at reference video of flags, is that it's a very wrinkly thing. And that's often because, you know, it's been coiled up or it's been sitting out on a pole all day and it's flopping and it's got all sorts of wrinkles and things in it. So, yeah, for that purpose, we created this one here, which is a special map, which our original texture guy was like, I don't know why we need this map. I'm like, no, trust me, it's gonna be awesome. And what this does is it's a bump map, but it's for adding wrinkles to the object. So, if we duplicate this image texture here, click open, and we add in that wrinkles, which is this one right here, you can see we've got a normal map. So I'm going to use that normal map, click open, and if I was to add in a normal map node after it, plug it into that, make sure that you're using non-color data, and then drag that into the diffuse input, and then make sure, by the way, that you are using the square UV map, not through the mapping node, because that'll be too, then it'll be like times 8 or whatever, which is really, really tiny detail, but through the square value. Okay, and now you can see it's like we've got extra detail in our cloth sim, which is really handy. I don't want 1 as a strength, that's too high. Somewhere between 0.2 and 0.1 I found does look pretty good. Okay, so we've got some wrinkles in our flag now. It's starting to look like a real flag, but we've lost that bump, right? That detail there, because you can see there's only one normal input. But thankfully, if you just connect it, let me just move this across. Okay, if we now take that and plug that into the normal input of the bump node, you've now got both. So you've got the displacement, of the actual fabric, like up close, you got that detail, but you've also got the wrinkles. So I can increase the wrinkle effect over there by doing that, and I could increase our fabric hash pattern appearing over it as well. Just like that. Awesome. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, you might be wondering, like, how do we get it to actually look like fabric, right? Now, fabric is actually, it's a diffuse shader. So there's another shader, and I used to use this as well, because Velvet seems like the one that you should use. Velvet, in my understanding, I could be wrong, someone can correct me in the comments, but I believe Velvet is for surfaces which have a lot of like tiny microscopic hair across it, because what it's doing is it's sort of lighting up the edges, like not the front face facing the camera, but it's lighting up the edges. So if you've got a furry, like microscopic fur, then it makes sense to use the Velvet, but otherwise you should be using just the flat diffuse. But in order to make it look like a proper diffuse, what you need to do is you need to give it that sort of fuzz effect. Like if you look at the edge of fabric, you probably can't see it on my shirt, but as it sort of rounds the edge, like imagine somebody wearing a jumper, right? Like a fuzzy jumper. On the edges, you'll see it becomes a little bit lighter, right? Like you sort of get a little bit of light coming off the edge there. So we can get that effect very easily, and this is the way that you should be doing fabric. Not use the Velvet one, but if you add in underneath input, where is it? Layer weight, okay? If you use layer weight, I'll control shift and I'll click on this to actually show you how it looks. If you want that, by the way, that functionality, if you type in Wrangler and enable the node Wrangler, enable that, yeah, you'll be able to do that. You control shift and then left click on what it is you want to play with. So this, all we're looking at is the black and white values of this. So you can see that as I set this blend value down, you can see that Fresnel is doing that edge effect. If you've watched my PBR tutorial, you know all about Fresnel. But essentially, yeah, it's that edge point right there. The reason, like, there's not much difference between Fresnel and this layer weight, except that if you see the back-facing plane through a Fresnel node, it looks wrong. So if this flag was to flop down and you were to see the back face, it would look totally wrong. Whereas this layer weight one actually looks correct. So I've been told. Or maybe it's the facing one that's actually correct. I have no idea. Either way, I'm just going to use the layer weight, all right? I know what works. That's what I'm sticking with. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take this color input from our flag there, and I want to control it through this layer weight Fresnel node, and then use it with a mix RGB node right here. So I'm going to drop in a mix RGB node. So I'm taking the color, and I'm taking the Fresnel and using that to control between these two colors. So we've now got the flag color and we've got a white color underneath it. And then what's really cool is you can set this, instead of mix, you can change it to screen, so that now it only takes the light values from this color, which means that if I was to turn this down, then you would see less and less of that Fresnel effect. So it's sort of like this now becomes the strength of that fuzzy edge, that fuzzy Fresnel edge, which is really cool. I like it. So let me just set this. I might actually go higher. Yeah, go a little bit higher. Why not? But go lower on this, because I quite like that fuzzy sort of edge there. Cool. And then with all the bump and everything, now you can see it's starting to look a little bit more like fabric, which is good. Now there's one more thing that I wanted to show you, and that is with our map here, this canvas map. There is one map which you've probably never used before, and it's one I wanted to include in the tutorial, but it is an object ID map. Texturing XYZ has the same thing as well. But essentially what it's done is we've broken up, because we created this fabric digitally, we were able to separate it so that different threads have different colors. Because that's something that you actually see a lot in the real world. Like if you next time sit on a couch and have a look at it, even though it looks like one color, like a gray couch, it's usually made up of like white and black threads. Now, if you don't have a way to split up the colors of the fabric, you can't do that effect, that black and white effect. So that's what this object ID map will allow us to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'll just add another image texture node here. Click open and go back to the canvas wherever you've downloaded the canvas, and then click on object ID and click open image. Now here, if I just have a look at this, you can see the effect. I want to make it sure that I'm using the same as that. Okay, so up close. So now if I was to just very quickly change to the color right underneath it, oh, you can't really see it. Huh. All right, let's move in. Oh, if you see this, by the way, this clipping effect, and it's really annoying you, little tip, you can turn down the clipping value to something lower, and then you can zoom the camera in a lot further. It's just a fun tip, right? So fun. Okay, so there's the threads. Now, if I control click on this, you can see that the threads are now separated. So you've got green and you've got red. And you might be thinking like, well, that's cool, but I don't want either of the threads to be green or red. So how do I use that? Well, check this out. If you hit Shift A and then underneath converter, you've got something which is separate RGB. So if you click and you move that here, you can see that I can now set either that green or that red as the one which is white, okay? Which is really cool. So what you can do now, check this out. I love this, because that's when this is how you make it look really cool, like real fabric. Is I'm going to make one of the threads look a little bit darker than the other threads. So I'm going to keep this color, this value here. So I'll actually drop it in before our Fresnel effect on the fabric. So right about here. Oh, I want to make sure that I'm using non-color data for this as well. Even though we're technically using the colors, I guess it does technically work better if you're not in color mode. Yeah, you can see it's actually crisper when you use non-color data. So right in here, just like I did with this, with our layer weight, I'm going to use another mix RGB, drop this in here, take the green value, or the red, depending on which one you wanted to use the thread count. Doesn't really matter, actually. But now that I've done that, you can see that I've got blue, that the flag showing up underneath it for its, for that part. But these little that part of the fabric there, that thread, I'm now going to use the same the same texture, which is now there's no difference between them, which is why they look identical. But if I add in a hue saturation node, drop that in here, and then if I turn the value down or up, by the way. Right, see that? Now it's making that a little bit darker. That thread count is a little bit darker. So when I throw it through this, you can see it looks a lot more like fabric. Like there's something about it. When I started using this, I'm like, oh, this is how you make fabric look like real fabric. It's because the threads, like in real life, threads have different colors. And you just don't get that with CT fabric. So by using this object ID, it looks really awesome. And there you go. So that is our flag, and it's pretty well finished. You could tweak it. You could add in a glossy shader. I honestly wouldn't recommend it. Like this sort of fabric wouldn't really have that much of a gloss effect. I think this fuzzy Fresnel is already doing most of that as it is. If you wanted to, you could render out a pole for it to actually sit on, which would be, you know, pretty handy to have so that it's not just suspended in space. So just basically something there. I actually did a piece of thread, which was actually all it was a Bezier curve like that. And then I just turned up this depth and then the resolution and full, excuse me. And then I just turned that down and basically I just rotated that around until it looked, yeah, like the thread there. But for this, for this point, all right, enough. For this, all I'm going to do is just keep the pole there. I'm going to hit I to inset that point there, move that up, and then just like for whatever reason, every flag pole. I'm surprised I haven't messed up and said fag at one point in this tutorial. I missed that word. Not to actually call it to demean something, but when I was in school, it was like the go-to word when somebody was just being an idiot. Don't be a fag, you know. It's horrible. It's like, and I know that of course, obviously, you can't use it because it's demeaning to people that actually like what it's trying to say. You know, homosexual. But in school, it had a punch to it when you just called your friends a fag. All I'm saying is we need another punchy word. Could be anything, but has that same effect that fag had. Ah, dear. And I get some interesting comments now. All right. So essentially, I'm just trying to create that little bit at the end there. I mean, I haven't done this properly, but you get the idea. It's a little flagpole. Almost said it. And then you'd give that like a basic glossy shader. You know, pretty simple. Yeah, and that is basically it. So now you've got something which you could render out, sell on Pond 5 or whatever as footage, technically, if you wanted to. And that's basically it. So if you found this tutorial helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more tutorials like this one, go ahead and click on subscribe. And if you wanted to see all those settings for the cloth settings, all that stuff, those animated GIFs are sitting on Blender Guru, so the link for that is in the description. And yeah. I feel like I'm missing something. Oh yeah, if you wanted to do your final animation, by the way, yeah, just do make sure that you hit bake on that. Otherwise, you might lose frames and it'll go all wonky. So just hit bake there and it'll go through the whole process at the top there and actually bake your sim. But that's it. Then it's ready for your final rendering. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.